There exists a particular quality of silence that only manifests in the moment before a man abandons everything he was raised to become. Not the silence of meditation, not the silence of sleep. This is the silence that fills a chapel when the crown bearer stands at the altar holding the circlet that represents 3 centuries of unbroken succession and realizes with absolute clarity that he will not place it on his head. Aldrich Northmarch stood in the chapel of continuance, morning light streaming through stained glass windows that depicted his ancestors in scenes of triumph. The coronation crown rested on a velvet cushion before him waiting. Emeralds and sapphires caught the light. Gold worked into the shape of mountain peaks, the symbol of Ridgeholme's eternal strength. 29 years of preparation had led to this moment. 29 years of tutors and weapons masters and diplomatic instructors. 29 years of being told in 1,000 subtle and unsubtle ways that his life belonged not to him but to the kingdom, to the legacy, to the unbroken chain of Northmarch rule. The crown was exquisite. It had crowned 14 kings before him. It would crown whoever came after. But it would not crown Aldrich Northmarch. He looked at it one final time, committing the details to memory, not because he wanted to remember it, but because he wanted to be certain years from now that he had actually seen it clearly before he walked away. Then he turned and left through the side door that led to the rose garden, where a horse waited with saddlebags already packed, and rode north toward a life the kingdom would never understand, never forgive, and eventually try very hard to end. But that morning, with frost still clinging to the chapel stones in the city of Cragmont, just beginning to wake below Aldrich Northmarch was not thinking about kingdoms or crowns or the fury his absence would unleash. He was thinking about gray-green skin warmed by firelight, about a voice like stone and honey, about a boy with his mother's tusks in his own stubborn determination who had looked at Aldrich 3 months ago and asked with the devastating directness of a 6-year-old, "If you're my father now, does that mean you'll stay?" Aldrich had not been able to answer then. The words had caught in his throat, tangled with duty and impossibility and the weight of a crown he hadn't yet refused. Now riding north through pine forests that smelled of resin and approaching winter, he had his answer. Yes, I'll stay. The village of Millstone Ford existed in the narrow gap between Ridgeholme's northern border and the territories claimed by the Orc clans of the Ironwood. That uncertain space on maps where cartographers wrote disputed or unaffiliated, or sometimes just left blank. It wasn't much of a village. 47 permanent residents, another dozen who came and went with the seasons. A mill that worked when the river ran high enough, which was most of the year. A trading post that sold to both humans and orcs with the careful neutrality of someone who couldn't afford to take sides. A scattering of houses built from riverstone and pine timber, weathered by mountain winters into a uniform gray-brown that made them look like they'd grown from the landscape rather than been constructed upon it. Aldrich had found the place 8 months ago during what his advisors believed was a diplomatic reconnaissance of the Northern Territories. What it actually was a desperate attempt to see if there was anywhere in the world where he could simply exist without the weight of his name crushing everything he touched. He'd found Millstone Ford, and in Millstone Ford he'd found Vera. Or rather, Vera had found him. He'd been attempting to repair a wheel on his travel wagon, and attempting being the operative word as he'd been trained in diplomacy and sword work, not carpentry, when a shadow fell across his work. He'd looked up to find an orc woman watching him with the particular expression of someone observing a task being done badly and deciding whether to intervene or let natural consequences teach the lesson. "The axle is cracked," she'd said. Her voice had that characteristic orc resonance, deeper than any human voice, with harmonics that suggested she could, if needed, make herself heard across a battlefield. "You keep working on the wheel, but the wheel isn't the problem." "I'm aware the axle is cracked," Aldrich had said, with more defensiveness than the situation warranted. "I was getting to it." "You were not getting to it. You were hoping the wheel would somehow compensate for a structural failure in the axle." She crossed her arms. "This is not how things work. Are you offering to help or just here to provide commentary?" "I am deciding." She'd stood there for what felt like a very long time, those gold-amber eyes examining not just his wagon, but him, his clothes too fine for a common traveler, his hands too soft for a workman, the sword at his belt too well-balanced to be decorative. Then she crouched down, lifted the entire wagon with one arm, while she examined the axle with her free hand and said, "The crack can be bound with iron bands. Not permanent, but it will hold for another 100 miles. After that, you need a new axle. I don't suppose you know where I might find one. I know where you might find someone capable of making one." She'd lowered the wagon with careful control. Whether I tell you is a separate question. That had been the beginning. The house Aldrich had built with Vera doing most of the actual building, while Aldrich measured things and handed her tools and gradually learned the difference between competent assistance and enthusiastic incompetence, sat on the eastern edge of Millstone Ford, where the forest crept close to the river. It had 3 rooms now, originally 2, but they'd added a third when Cale had come to live with them. Cale, 6 years old, all knees and elbows and fierce concentration. Half-orc, which meant he stood taller than human children his age but smaller than orc children, caught in that uncertain space between worlds that Aldrich had come to understand was actually its own complete world, not a compromise but a synthesis. The boy's mother had died 2 years ago. Fever sudden and merciless. His father, an orc warrior from the Ironwood clans, had tried to care for him alone, but war and grief and the demands of clan politics had made it impossible. Vara, who was the boy's mother's cousin, had taken him in. That had been a year ago. Aldrich had met them 6 months after that. He'd fallen in love with both of them in the particular way that love happens when you're not looking for it gradually, then all at once, then so thoroughly that trying to remember what your life was like before seems like trying to remember someone else's dream. Vara had been more cautious. Orc courtship customs Aldrich had learned involved a great deal of careful observation and very little direct declaration. You demonstrated your worthiness through action, through consistency, through the slow accumulation of proof that you were someone who could be trusted with the vulnerable parts of another person's life. Aldrich had demonstrated his worthiness by staying. By learning to cook the way Vera liked, food cooked heavily, seasoned slightly burnt, served with the kind of dark bread that required serious chewing. By sitting with Kael during nightmares, not offering false comfort, but simply being present in the dark. By fixing things that broke and not expecting praise for it. By being, for the first time in his life, someone defined not by his title, but by his choices. 3 months ago, Kael had started calling him Father. Not Papa. Kael still used that for his birth father, who visited when clan duties allowed. But Father in the Orcish way, Darak, which meant the one who teaches, the one who stays, the one who builds the daily structure of safety. Vara had watched this development with those careful amber eyes, saying nothing but noting everything. 2 months ago, she'd kissed him for the first time. They'd been working on the roof replacing shingles damaged in a storm, and she'd simply turned to him in the middle of handing him a hammer and kissed him with the same decisive competence she brought to every other task. Then she'd gone back to the shingles as if nothing had happened. Aldrich had stood there for a full minute, holding the hammer before his brain rebooted enough to continue working. That night, after Kishal was asleep, she'd said, "I have decided you are acceptable. That's the most romantic thing anyone's ever said to me. You have led a sheltered life then." But her tusks had caught the firelight in a way that suggested she was pleased. 1 month ago, Aldrich had realized that the coronation was approaching, that decisions would need to be made, that he could not continue existing in this suspended state of being, technically the crown prince, while living a life completely incompatible with that role. He'd returned to Cragmont to handle certain necessary arrangements, to access documents that existed only in the royal archives, to confirm suspicions he'd been developing about his father's reign. What he'd found had made the choice both easier and infinitely more complicated. Now, 3 days after abandoning his own coronation, Aldrich guided his horse down the familiar path to Millstone Ford and felt something in his chest loosen for the first time in 72 hours. The house was exactly as he'd left it, smoke rising from the chimney, Kale's practice sword propped against the woodpile, Vera's work gloves hanging from a nail by the door. He dismounted and stood for a moment just looking at it. This small house, this impossible life. Then the door opened and Kale came running out, shouting, "Derek, Derek, you're back!" with the uncomplicated joy of a child who hadn't yet learned that adults sometimes left and didn't return. Aldrich caught him in a hug that lifted the boy off his feet. Kale wrapped his arms around Aldrich's neck and said into his shoulder, "Vara said you might not come back, but I knew you would." I told her. Over the boy's shoulder, Aldrich met Vara's eyes. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed, expression carefully neutral, in the way that meant she was feeling something too large to show. I came back, Aldrich said to both of them. I'm staying. Vara's expression shifted not to happiness exactly, but to something more complex, relief and concern in equal measure. Come inside, she said. We need to talk. They waited until Kael was asleep before having the conversation neither wanted to have, but both knew was necessary. Vera made tea with the particular ceremony she reserved for serious discussions. The ritual of boiling water, measuring herbs, pouring carefully into clay cups that Aldrich had bought from the village potter 3 months ago because Vera had mentioned once that she liked them. Small things. The architecture of a shared life built from accumulated small things. She set a cup in front of him and sat on the opposite side of the table, which told him this was going to be more difficult than he'd hoped. Tell me, she said, all of it. So he told her. About the coronation he'd abandoned, about the chaos his absence would create, was already creating, given that it had been 3 days and the royal guard would absolutely be searching by now. About the fact that he was technically still the heir to Ridgeholm's throne, and that walking away from a coronation didn't actually nullify that in any legal sense. About the documents he'd found in the royal archives. This was the part that made Vera's expression go very still. 17 years ago, Aldrich said, my father signed what he called the Northern Settlement Protocol. It was presented to the Royal Council as a defensive measure, a way to establish clear boundaries between Ridgeholm territory and the Ironwood clan lands. I remember, Vera said quietly, the year of the burning. The year of the burning, Aldrich echoed. The official record says that 3 settlements on the disputed border were destroyed by Ironwood raiders. Unprovoked attacks. My father used those attacks to justify increased military presence in the north. Vera's hands were very still around her teacup. The document I found, the actual protocol, not the public summary, tells a different story. It authorized Ridgeholm forces to burn those settlements, to make it look like orc raiders, to create the justification for military expansion. Why silver deposits, discovered in the northern mountains 6 months before the burnings. The settlements were in the way. Negotiating relocation would have taken years and attracted attention to the deposits. Creating a crisis was faster. The fire popped. Outside, wind moved through the pines with a sound like distant water. How many died? Vera asked. The official count is 37. The actual protocol mentions acceptable civilian losses without specifying numbers. Aldrich's voice was flat. I found a separate report sealed that puts the number closer to 60, including children. Vera set down her cup with careful precision. And you found this 1 month ago? Yes. And you came back here to think, to decide. I came back here because this is where I needed to be to think clearly. And you decided to abandon the coronation. I decided I couldn't become king of a kingdom built on that lie. I couldn't stand in front of the nobles and the people and swear to uphold my father's legacy when his legacy included ordering the murder of 60 people for silver deposits. Vera was quiet for a long time. The tea steamed between them, untouched, now growing cold. What happens next? She finally asked. I don't know. The Royal Council will send people to find me, to convince me to come back, or failing that, to forcibly return me for the good of the kingdom. They will find you eventually. Yes. And when they do, Aldrich met her eyes. I want to make the protocol public, all of it. The murders, the cover-up, everything. I want the kingdom to know what was done in their name. That will destroy your family's reputation. My family's reputation was built on 60 murders. I'm comfortable destroying it. Vera's expression shifted, something that might have been approval, or might have been fear for what that choice would cost him. There is something you should know, she said quietly, about Kael's mother, about how she died. Aldrich went very still. Kael's mother was named Shara. She was from the Ironwood, but she lived for a time in the borderlands, in one of the mixed settlements that existed before the burnings. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. She survived the burning of North Cross. That was the settlement closest to the silver deposits. She was 17. She carried the scars for the rest of her life, burns across her back and arms. She never spoke of it, but I knew. Everyone from North Cross who survived carried marks. Vera's hands were trembling slightly. She pressed them flat on the table. The fever that killed her 2 years ago, it took hold in the old burn scars. The damage to her lungs from smoke inhalation that night, 17 years ago, made her vulnerable. The healer said it was old trauma that created the opportunity for new infection. Vera, your father's orders didn't just kill 60 people that night. They killed Shara 17 years later. They orphaned Kale. They, her voice caught. They set in motion everything that brought us here. The weight of that settled between them like snow. Silent, cold, absolute. Does Kale know, Brian, Aldrich asked, about his mother's scars? Yes. About their origin? No. He knows she was hurt before he was born. He doesn't know it was Ridge Home soldiers who hurt her. Should we tell him? I don't know, he's 6. How does a 6-year-old understand that kind of betrayal? Aldrich thought about Kael's fierce trust, the way he'd run to greet Aldrich earlier with absolute certainty that Aldrich would catch him, the way he said Duroc like it was a title and a promise and a choice all at once. If I make the protocol public, Aldrich said slowly, it will come out anyway. Someone will make the connection. Northcross, Shara, Kael, the child of a survivor raised by the son of the man who ordered the burning. Yes, and that will either destroy us or prove that the sins of fathers don't have to define their children, Vera finished, if we choose to make it mean something different. They sat in silence for a while. The fire burned low. Outside, the river ran over stones with its eternal patient sound. I need you to understand something, Aldrich said. If I do this, if I make the protocol public, it will put all of us in danger. The Crown will not allow this information to spread without fighting to contain it. They'll come for me, for the documents, for anyone associated with the revelation. I understand. They may accuse you of manipulating me, of using Kael to influence the Crown Prince for some political purpose. Let them try. Vara, this is serious. I am being serious. She leaned forward. Do you think I have survived this long by avoiding difficult things? Do you think I raised Shara's son through grief and uncertainty by choosing only safe paths? She reached across the table and took his hand. Hers was larger, calloused from work, warm with the higher body temperature all orcs carried. You came here looking for a place to exist without the weight of who you were supposed to be. You found that, but you also found something else, a reason to go back. Not to be king, to be the man who tells the truth even when the truth is costly. I don't want to be that man. Too late. You already are. She squeezed his hand. The question is whether you do it alone or with us. With you, Aldrich said immediately. Always with you, but I need you to know what you're agreeing to. I know exactly what I'm agreeing to. I'm agreeing to stand beside someone who would rather burn his own legacy than let a lie stand. I'm agreeing to help raise a boy in a world where adults choose truth over comfort. I'm agreeing to build something that matters more than safety. She smiled, her tusks catching the low firelight. Besides, I've always wanted to see Cragmont. I hear the architecture is impressive. Despite everything, Aldrich laughed. You want to storm the Capitol? I want to stand beside you while you do what needs doing. If that involves storming a Capitol, so be it. They sat for a moment longer, hands joined across the table while the fire burned down to embers and the night settled around their small house at the edge of everything. Then Vera said, we should sleep. Tomorrow we plan. The day after we act. That's simple. That's simple. They told Kyle in the morning in the careful language you use with children when the truth is complicated but necessary. They told him that Aldrich's family wanted him to come back to Cragmont, that it was going to be complicated, that there were things about Kael's mother, about what happened to her when she was young, that were connected to Aldrich's father in ways that were hard but important to understand. Kael listened with the intense focus he brought to difficult concepts, his small face serious. When they finished, he said, so your father did a bad thing, and it hurt my mother. Yes, Aldrich said, but you're not your father. No. And you're going to tell people about the bad thing, even though it's hard. Yes. Kael thought about this for a moment. Then he said with the devastating logic of children, that seems right. Bad things should be told about. Otherwise, people might do them again. Vara made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been something else. Kael looked between them. Are we all going to Cragmont? Would you want to, Mom? Aldrich asked. Will there be horses? Many horses. Then yes. Kale nodded decisively. But I'm bringing my practice sword. And Button. Button was a wooden practice dummy Vera had carved for him. It had a face drawn on it with charcoal. Kale practiced strikes against it every morning with intense seriousness. We'll bring Button, Aldrich agreed. They left Millstone Ford 4 days later after making arrangements with their neighbors and securing the house for what might be a long absence. The village potter offered to check on the place weekly. The mill operator's wife packed them food for the journey. The trading post owner, a sharp-eyed woman named Mara, who had always known exactly who Aldrich was, but had never commented on it, pressed a small leather pouch into Vera's hand. Travel money, Mara said. Consider it payment for all the times you fixed things around the post without asking for compensation. I cannot accept. You can and will. You're heading into trouble. Trouble requires resources. Take the resources. Vera accepted the pouch. When she opened it later, she found not just coins, but a note. Some of us believe truth matters more than comfort. Don't let them make you small. They rode south with Kyle on a pony between them, chattering about everything and nothing with the inexhaustible energy of a 6-year-old on an adventure. By the third day, news of the abandoned coronation had spread far enough that people in the villages they passed recognized Aldrich, despite his attempt at anonymity. Most reactions were confused. Some were hostile. A few were quietly supportive in the way people support things they don't fully understand, but sense might be important. On the 5th day, they encountered a royal patrol. 6 soldiers in Ridge Home colors led by a young captain named Theron, who Aldrich vaguely remembered from weapons training at the palace. Theron's face cycled through several expressions when he saw them. Recognition, confusion, relief, concern, before settling on professional neutrality. Your Highness, Theron said carefully, the crown has been searching for you. I'm aware. You're asked to return to Cragmont immediately. The coronation can still proceed. The council is willing to overlook your absence. I'm not returning for a coronation. Theron glanced at Vera at KL at the travel bags that clearly indicated this was not a temporary excursion. Then why are you traveling toward the capital? To deliver something to the royal council. Documents they'll want to see. What kind of documents? The kind that explain why I left in the first place. Theron was quiet for a moment, clearly trying to navigate the impossible situation of a prince who'd abandoned his coronation and was now traveling with an orc woman and a half-orc child toward a city that didn't know what to do with any of them. Your Highness, I have orders to escort you back to Cragmont, with or without your cooperation. Then you'll need to escort all of us, Aldrich said, because I'm not going anywhere without my family. The word hung in the air. Family. Theron looked at Kyle, who looked back with the frank, unblinking stare of a child who hasn't learned to be self-conscious. Is this boy my son, Aldrich said, in every way that matters. Theron's expression suggested he was rapidly recalculating everything he thought he knew about the Crown Prince. Captain, Vera said, speaking for the first time. Her voice had that deep orc resonance that made even simple statements sound significant. We are traveling to Cragmont of our own will. Your orders are to ensure the prince's return. We will fulfill your orders and our intentions simultaneously. There is no conflict here. Theron looked at her. She looked back with the patient confidence of someone who had stared down more intimidating things than a confused soldier. Very well, Theron said finally. I'll escort you to Cragmont. But I should warn you the city is tense. Your absence caused considerable disruption. There are factions that want answers, others that want you on the throne regardless of your wishes. It's not safe. I didn't expect it to be safe, Aldrich said. I expected it to be necessary. They rode the rest of the way to Cragmont with a military escort that was technically protection and practically surveillance. Kyle thought the soldiers were fascinating. He peppered Theron with questions about armor and weapons and battle formations until the young captain, clearly not trained in dealing with enthusiastic 6-year-olds, began answering with the careful patience of someone handling a small friendly explosion. Vera rode in silence, observing everything. Aldrich could see her cataloging details. The soldiers' reactions, the villages they passed, through the gradual increase in fortifications as they approached the capital. You're planning, he said quietly when they had a moment of relative privacy. Always. Planning what? Exit routes, defensive positions, threat assessments. She glanced at him. You're walking into a situation where powerful people will want you silenced. I'm ensuring we can leave if silencing you becomes violent. You think it will come to that? I think people who order 60 murders to protect silver deposits are capable of ordering more murders to protect their reputations. Point taken. Cragmont came into view on the 8th day of their journey. The city rose from the plains like a challenge to geography, walls of gray stone climbing the hillside in concentric rings, each level larger and more elaborate than the last, culminating in the palace complex at the summit. Aldrich had grown up in that palace. He knew every corridor, every hidden passage, every window that looked out on the city below. He knew the gardens where he'd played as a child, the training yards where he'd learned sword work, the library where he'd first read about the kingdoms that had risen and fallen before Ridgeholm even existed. He'd loved it once in the uncomplicated way you love things when you're young and haven't yet learned that beauty can be built on bones. Now looking at it from the approach road, he saw it differently. Still beautiful, still impressive, still the accumulated achievement of 3 centuries of rule, but built on secrets, maintained by lies. Powerful because it had learned to call murder by softer names. It's bigger than I expected, Vera said, her first comment on the city. Wait until you see the inside. Will they let us in, an orc and a half-orc child? They'll let us in because I'm with you. Whether they let us leave is a different question. Kale, who'd been mostly quiet for the last few miles, suddenly said, Father, are you scared? Aldrich looked down at the boy. Kale was watching him with those sharp eyes that saw more than adults expected. Yes, Aldrich said honestly. I'm very scared. But you're doing it anyway. Yes. Vara says that's what bravery is, being scared and doing the thing anyway. Vara is correct. Kale nodded, satisfied with this answer. Then he reached out and took Aldrich's hand. They rode through Cragmont's gates together, a crown prince who'd abandoned his throne, an orc woman who'd never set foot in a human capital, and a 6-year-old boy who carried in his bloodline the proof that the divide between their peoples was neither inevitable nor unbridgeable. Behind them, Captain Theron and his soldiers followed, uncertain whether they were escorting the future king or guarding 3 people who were about to commit treason. The answer, as it turned out, would be both. The Palace of Ridgeholm had been designed to impress, intimidate, and endure in that order. Every corridor was wider than necessary, every ceiling higher, every door required 2 people to open, which meant you could never enter a room quietly or without being announced by the simple physics of bronze hinges that weighed as much as a grown man. Aldrich had grown up navigating these spaces with the unconscious ease of someone born to them. Now walking through them with Vara and Kale, he saw them through their eyes, the excessive grandeur, the deliberate intimidation, the architecture of power that reminded everyone who entered exactly how small they were meant to feel. Kale stayed close to Vera, his hand gripping hers while his eyes tracked every detail. Guards in ceremonial armor, tapestries depicting battles from centuries past, portraits of stern-faced kings who all seemed to be looking down with identical expressions of disappointed judgment. They were taken to guest quarters in the East Wing, not the royal apartments where Aldrich had lived his entire life, but rooms reserved for visiting dignitaries of uncertain status, comfortable enough to avoid open insult, isolated enough to maintain control. A servant appeared within minutes of their arrival, a young woman named Lysa, who'd worked in the palace since Aldrich was a teenager. She kept her eyes carefully neutral as she showed them the accommodations, explained mealtimes, and pretended not to notice that the crown prince had returned to the palace with an orc partner and a half-orc child. The royal council requests your presence at tomorrow's morning session, Lysa said to Aldrich. 10 o'clock sharp in the high chamber. Not today. They've been in emergency session since your departure. Apparently they need tonight to prepare. Prepare for what? Lysa's neutral expression cracked slightly. For whatever you're planning to do, Your Highness. The entire palace has been speculating for 8 days. After she left, Vera examined the rooms with the systematic attention she brought to any new environment. She checked the windows locked, but the locks were old enough that she could probably force them if needed. She noted the doors, 2 exits, one to the main corridor, one to a servant's passage. She tested the furniture human-scaled, which meant the chairs would be uncomfortable for her and the bed would be tight for 2 people her size. We're not prisoners, Aldrich said, watching her tactical assessment. Not officially. Not yet, Vera corrected. She sat on the bed. It creaked alarmingly under her weight. Tomorrow you tell the council about the protocol. How do you think they'll respond? Denial, probably. Claims that I've been misled or manipulated. They'll want to see the documents, which you have. Copies. The originals are hidden. Where, in a place no one would think to look, with someone no one would think to ask. Vera waited. The palace librarian, Aldrich said. Master Torvin. He's been maintaining the archives for 40 years. He showed me where the protocol was hidden, not because I asked, but because he thought I should know. He's been waiting 17 years for someone to do something about it. Can you trust him? He's spent 40 years watching kings hide secrets in his archives. I think he's ready to see some of those secrets face light. Kale, who'd been exploring the room with the thorough attention of a child in a new place, discovered a window seat with cushions. He climbed onto it and pressed his face against the glass, looking out at the city below. It's so big, he said. All those houses, do people really live in all of them? They do, Aldrich said, joining him at the window. Are they good people? Some are, some aren't. Most are trying to be better than they were yesterday. Kael thought about this. Like you. Exactly like me. That night, after Kael was asleep in the unnecessarily large bed, Button the practice dummy propped in the corner like a small wooden sentinel, Aldrich and Vera sat by the window and watched the city lights. I've never been in a place this size, Vera said quietly. It's overwhelming. You hide it well. Years of practice. Orcs don't show uncertainty to potential threats. She glanced at him. And make no mistake, this palace, this council, they're absolutely threats. I know. Tomorrow, when you present the protocol, they will try to discredit you. They'll say you've been compromised, that I've influenced you, that a prince who'd abandoned his coronation clearly isn't thinking clearly. Let them. They may also try to remove Kael from our custody, claim he's in danger, use child welfare as a weapon to control you. Aldrich's jaw tightened. They can try, but Kael's legal guardianship was established through Ironwood clan law. Ridgeholm has no jurisdiction over orc custody decisions. Since when does legal jurisdiction stop people with power from doing what they want? She wasn't wrong. Aldrich had seen enough of palace politics to know that law was often just another tool to be shaped by those who could afford better craftsmen. Then we don't rely on law, he said. We rely on truth, public truth, the kind that's harder to bury when everyone's already heard it. You want to make the protocol public immediately. I want to make it impossible to suppress. Master Torvin has connections with scholars throughout the kingdom. By tomorrow afternoon, I want copies of the protocol in 20 different cities. I want it being read by historians, by priests, by merchants' guild leaders. I want it everywhere before the council can coordinate a response. Vera smiled slowly. You've been planning this. I've had 8 days of writing to think about it. 8 days of watching villages react to seeing their crown prince traveling with an orc family. 8 days of realizing that the kingdom's idea of what's acceptable is much narrower than what's actually possible. He took her hand. They want me to choose between you and the crown. Between Kael and my duty. Between the life I want and the life they need me to want. I'm going to show them it's not a choice, that their framework is broken, that everything they think they know about what a prince can be is wrong. That's ambitious. I learned from someone who lifted an entire wagon with one arm because she was tired of watching me do things badly. Vera laughed low and warm. I do recall that incident. I'm applying the same principle. They want me to struggle within their broken system. I'm going to lift the whole thing and show them the crack underneath. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the city settle into night. Somewhere below, people were finishing dinner, putting children to bed, having ordinary evenings in a kingdom that had no idea how much was about to change. Aldrich, Vera said quietly, after tomorrow, after the protocol is public and the council reacts, we may not be safe here or anywhere in Ridgeholm. I know. We should have a plan for where we go if we need to leave quickly. North, Aldrich said immediately, back to Millstone Ford, or deeper into the Ironwood territories if Millstone isn't safe. The clans might not welcome us. A human prince would complicate their politics. A human prince carrying proof that Ridgeholm murdered their people might be useful to their politics. Vera considered this. Perhaps. But we'd be giving up any claim to influence Ridgeholm's future, any chance to reform from within. I gave up that chance when I walked out of the coronation chapel. I'm not trying to reform the kingdom anymore. I'm trying to expose the truth. What happens after that is for other people to decide. Noble of you. Pragmatic of me, I know my limitations. Governance isn't one of my strengths, but standing in front of powerful people and telling them uncomfortable truths that I can do. Yes, Vera said, squeezing his hand, that you can do very well. The morning session of the Royal Council convened at precisely 10 o'clock in the High Chamber, a room designed to make anyone standing before the council feel appropriately small and appropriately judged. The council sat at a raised semicircular table. 7 members representing the major noble houses, plus Queen Mother Evelyn Aldrich's mother, who served as regent in the absence of a crowned king. Aldrich stood in the center of the floor, the traditional position for those giving testimony or receiving judgment. Vara stood beside him, which was not traditional, but which Aldrich had insisted upon. Kyle waited outside with Captain Theron, who'd volunteered to keep the boy company during what promised to be a tense proceeding. Queen Mother Evelyn spoke first. She was 63, sharp as winter ice, and had been managing Ridgeholm's politics since Aldrich's father died 7 years ago. Prince Aldrich, she said, her voice carrying the particular tone of a mother who is furious but constrained by public setting. You have caused considerable disruption by your absence from the coronation ceremony. The council requires an explanation. I have one. It's not pleasant. We'll endure. Aldrich reached into his jacket and produced the document he'd carried from Millstone Ford. The Northern Settlement Protocol, copied in his own hand from the original he'd found in the archives. 17 years ago, my father authorized the burning of 3 settlement points in the disputed Northern Territories. The burnings were blamed on Ironwood raiders. They were actually carried out by Ridgeholm forces on my father's direct orders. The chamber went very quiet. The purpose was to create a crisis that would justify military expansion into regions where silver deposits had been discovered. 60 civilians died. The kingdom built its northern mining operations on their deaths and called it defensive policy. He set the document on the table. This is the protocol that authorized those murders. I'm making it public today. Lord Carrow, head of the Merchant Council, recovered first. That's an extraordinary claim. Do you have proof beyond this document of uncertain origin? I have testimony from survivors. I have accounts from soldiers who participated. I have the original protocol sealed with my father's own signet ring, currently in the custody of Master Torvin in the archives. Master Torvin is an old man whose loyalty to the crown is questionable. His loyalty is to truth, Aldrich interrupted, which is apparently more questionable than I realized. Lady Marissa, representing the Northern Territories, leaned forward. Even if this document is genuine, and I'm not conceding that it is, why bring it forward now? Your father is dead. The settlements are long destroyed. What purpose does raking up old wounds serve? Justice, Vera said. Everyone turned to look at her. She met their stares calmly. My cousin died from injuries sustained in the North Cross burning. Not that night, but 17 years later, when old scars made her vulnerable to infection. Her son is the child waiting outside these chambers. The boy your former king orphaned with a policy decision. You cannot prove causation. I can prove that Ridgeholm soldiers burned settlements full of civilians and lied about it. I can prove that the crown built its wealth on murder. Whether you call that murder a policy decision or a war crime or an unfortunate necessity doesn't change the fact of what was done. Queen Mother Evelyn's expression was difficult to read. She looked at Aldrich for a long moment before speaking. You realize what you're doing. You're destroying your father's legacy, my husband's reputation, the foundation of our northern expansion. Yes, for what, a woman you've known less than a year, a child who isn't even your blood. For the truth, Aldrich said quietly. And yes, for them, because they deserve a kingdom that doesn't build itself on lies. Because Kyle deserves to grow up in a world where powerful people are held accountable for what they do. Noble sentiments, Lord Carrow said dryly, also politically suicidal. You understand you have made yourself uncrownable. No council will accept a king who publicly denounces his own father. I understand. Then what do you want? I want the protocol published in the official record. I want formal acknowledgement of what was done. I want reparations paid to survivors and descendants of the burned settlements. And I want the northern mining operations audited to determine how much wealth was built on stolen land. Impossible, three council members said simultaneously. Possible, Aldrich corrected, just costly. To reputation, to pride, to the comfortable story this kingdom tells itself, but possible. Lady Marissa stood. This council will not. This council doesn't have a choice, Aldrich said. I've already given copies of the protocol to 20 different scholars, merchants, and civic leaders throughout Ridgeholm. By tomorrow, it will be public knowledge, regardless of what you decide here. Your only choice is whether you lead that conversation or get crushed by it. The room erupted, council members shouting over each other, accusations of treason and manipulation and mental unfitness, the carefully maintained decorum of the High Chamber collapsing into raw anger. Queen Mother Evelyn let it continue for exactly 30 seconds. Then she struck the table with her gavel, a single sharp crack that silenced everyone. Enough. She looked at Aldrich with an expression he couldn't quite read. You've made your move. Now we make ours. This session is adjourned for deliberation. You're confined to your quarters until we reach a decision. We're not prisoners. You are now. Aldrich had anticipated this possibility. He'd hoped it wouldn't come to it, but he'd planned for it. He pulled a small whistle from his pocket and blew two sharp notes. The servant's door at the back of the chamber opened. Master Torvin entered, followed by 6 other people scholars, archivists, a priest from the Cathedral of Records. These witnesses, Aldrich said, have all reviewed the original protocol in the Royal Archives. They're prepared to testify to its authenticity, and they've all made their own copies which are currently being distributed throughout the capital. He looked at his mother. Confine us if you want, but the truth is already loose. You can't contain it anymore. Evelyn's expression finally cracked not into anger, but into something more complex. Respect maybe, or resignation, or the particular exhaustion that comes from watching your son become someone you didn't raise him to be and realizing you can't stop it. Get out, she said quietly. All of you. We'll deliberate and summon you when we've decided how to proceed. Aldrich and Vera left the High Chamber, collected kale from Captain Theron, and returned to their quarters. That went well, Vera said dryly once they were alone. Better than expected, honestly. I thought they might arrest us immediately. They still might. Deliberation could be code for decide which dungeon. Optimistic of you. Cale, who'd been quiet since they picked him up, suddenly asked, Father, are we in trouble? Probably. The good kind of trouble or the bad kind? I'm not sure there's a good kind of being confined to palace quarters under armed guard. Vera says sometimes you have to get in trouble to fix something important. Vera says a lot of wise things. I know. That's why I listen to her. They spent the afternoon waiting. Servants brought food at regular intervals, excellent food, which Aldrich suspected was someone's way of apologizing for the confinement without actually apologizing. Evening came. The deliberation continued. Night fell. Still no word from the council. Aldrich was starting to consider the very real possibility that the council planned to simply leave them in indefinite limbo when there was a knock at the door. Not a servant's knock. Something more authoritative. Vera positioned herself between the door and KL automatically. Aldrich opened it to find Queen Mother Evelyn standing in the corridor alone. May I come in? She asked. Aldrich stepped aside. His mother entered, glanced around the room with the quick assessment of someone who'd managed palace logistics for 40 years and settled her gaze on Vera. You're the orc woman. I am. You love my son. I do. Enough to watch him destroy himself politically. He's not destroying himself. He's building something better from honest materials. Evelyn's lips twitched. That's one interpretation. She moved to the window, looked out at the city for a moment, then turned back to face them. The council is divided. 3 members want you arrested for treason. 2 want you quietly exiled. 1 wants to pretend this never happened. And Lady Marissa surprisingly wants to actually investigate the protocol's claims. And you, Aldrich asked. I want to know why you really did this, not the noble reason you gave the council. The real reason. Aldrich looked at Kyle, who was watching this exchange with wide eyes from where he sat with Button. Because that boy deserves better than the kingdom we built. Because Vara deserves a partner who doesn't carry that much blood debt. Because I looked at the crown and realized it was built on bones, and I couldn't put it on my head knowing that. Your father made terrible choices, I know. I loved him anyway. But I don't have to defend those choices. I don't have to carry that weight forward. Evelyn was quiet for a long moment. Then to Aldrich's surprise, she sat down in one of the uncomfortable chairs and suddenly looked every one of her 63 years. I knew, she said quietly. About the protocol. Not at the time, but after. 5 years after the burnings, I found the document while organizing your father's papers. I confronted him. He told me it was necessary, that kingdoms are built on hard choices, that I could either accept it or undermine everything we'd built. She looked at her hands. I accepted, but I chose our marriage, our position, our comfort over 60 dead people I'd never met. And I've been carrying that choice for 12 years. Mother, let me finish. She looked up at him. You did what I should have done, what I was too afraid to do. You chose truth over comfort. And now the council is terrified because if we acknowledge what your father did, if we pay reparations, if we admit the northern expansion was built on murder, it calls into question everything. Every policy, every decision, every comfortable assumption about our righteousness. Good, Aldrich said. Let them question. Let the whole kingdom question. That's how things change. Evelyn stood. The council will announce its decision tomorrow. I can't tell you what it will be that's genuinely still being debated, but I can tell you that whatever happens, you've already won something more important than their approval. What's that? The ability to look yourself in the mirror, to look at your son and know you chose truth over convenience. She moved toward the door, then paused. Your father was a good king in many ways, but he was also a man who could order 60 murders and call it policy. You're choosing to be different. That takes a kind of strength he never had. After she left, Vera said, your mother is more complex than I expected. Most people are, I've learned. Do you think the council will rule in our favor? I think the council will do whatever protects their power, but it doesn't matter. The truth is already public. They can punish us, exile us, even execute us if they're desperate enough. But they can't unmake what we've exposed. Comforting. I thought so. Cale had been unusually quiet during all of this. Now he climbed off his seat and walked over to stand in front of both of them. Father Vera, if we have to leave again, can we go back to Millstone Ford? If it's safe, yes, Aldrich said. What if it's not safe anywhere? Then we make somewhere safe, the three of us together. Same way we built our house, one piece at a time, fixing mistakes as we go, making something that holds. Cale seemed satisfied with this answer. He went back to Button and resumed whatever game he'd been playing, something that involved making the practice dummy fight invisible enemies. Vera leaned against Aldrich, her warmth familiar and grounding. We've come far from that first day with the broken wagon, she said. That was the day my life actually started. Everything before was just preparation. Dramatic, but accurate. They stood together at the window watching Cragmont's lights scatter across the hills like fallen stars, while a 6-year-old boy played with his practice dummy and dreamed of invisible battles, unaware that the adults in his life had just fought a very real one. Tomorrow would bring the council's decision. Tomorrow would determine whether they stayed or fled, whether Ridgeholm began the slow work of reckoning with its past or chose comfortable denial. But tonight they were together. A prince who'd abandoned his crown, an orc woman who'd never asked to be part of palace politics, and a boy who represented the possibility that the divisions between their peoples weren't insurmountable. A family built from impossible choices and stubborn love. That would have to be enough. The council's decision came at dawn. Not through official channels or formal announcement, but through the sound of boots in the corridor. Too many boots, moving too quickly. Aldrich was already awake. He'd barely slept watching the window as the city transitioned from night to the gray promise of morning. He was on his feet before the knock came, already positioning himself between the door and where Vera and Kael still slept. The knock was sharp military. Not a request, but an announcement. Captain Theron's voice came through the door. Your Highness, I need you to open up, now. Aldrich opened the door to find Theron with 8 guards all armed, all looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. "You're arresting us," Aldrich said. "I'm following orders. You specifically are to come with me to the council chamber immediately. The woman and child are to remain here under guard." "Not acceptable. It's not a negotiation." Vera appeared at Aldrich's shoulder, moving with the silent efficiency of someone who'd learned to assess threat situations before fully waking. Kale was behind her, clutching button, eyes wide but not yet frightened. "Where he goes, we go," Vera said flatly. Theron's jaw tightened. "My orders. Can accommodate 3 people as easily as 1. Vera finished. "Unless your orders specifically include separating families." "Do they?" Theron looked supremely uncomfortable. "They don't specify, but the council chamber isn't." "Then we're coming." Vera stepped forward. She was a full head taller than Theron and considerably broader. "You can accept that or explain to the council why you started a physical altercation with the Crown Prince's partner in front of his child." Theron looked at his guards. None of them seemed eager to forcibly remove a 6.5-foot orc woman from protective position over a 6-year-old boy. "Fine," Theron said. "Everyone comes, but keep the child quiet. The council is volatile this morning." They were escorted through corridors Aldrich knew intimately, but which felt foreign under armed guard. Servants pressed themselves against walls as they passed. Nobles, caught glimpsing them from doorways, quickly found reasons to be elsewhere. News had spread clearly. The palace knew something significant was happening. The High Chamber was fuller than yesterday. Not just the council, but representatives from major merchant guilds, religious orders, military leadership, witnesses to whatever was about to happen. Queen Mother Evelyn sat at the center of the council table, her expression carefully neutral. The other 6 council members arranged on either side with varying degrees of hostility or resignation on their faces. Master Torvin stood to one side with his fellow archivist, looking ancient and tired, but grimly satisfied. Aldrich, Vera, and Kale were directed to stand in the center of the chamber floor, the judgment position. Evelyn spoke without preamble. "Prince Aldrich Northmarch, you have presented this council with evidence of crimes committed during your father's reign, specifically the authorized burning of 3 civilian settlements, resulting in approximately 60 deaths." She paused. "The council has reviewed the Northern Settlement Protocol. We have examined the testimony of Master Torvin and his fellow archivists. We have verified the document's authenticity through various historical cross-references." "And," Aldrich asked when the silence stretched, "and we find the evidence credible." A murmur ran through the chamber. Aldrich felt Vera's hand find his. "However," Evelyn continued, "the question of what to do with credible evidence of historical crimes is complex. The council is divided on the appropriate response." Lord Caro stood. "With respect, Queen Mother, the council is divided on whether there should be any response. Some of us believe that revisiting decisions made during wartime 17 years after the fact serves no purpose except to destabilize current policy. Some of us," Lady Marissa countered, also standing, "believe that ignoring evidence of mass murder because it's inconvenient is how kingdoms rot from within." The chamber erupted into argument, council members shouting, guild representatives adding their voices, the priests from the Cathedral of Records demanding moral accountability. Evelyn let it continue for precisely 1 minute. Then she struck her gavel so hard the sound echoed like a gunshot. "Order," she commanded. "We will have order, or I will clear this chamber of everyone except the council." Silence fell. Evelyn looked directly at Aldrich. "You have forced this kingdom to confront an uncomfortable truth. You have done so in the most public, most disruptive way possible. You have made it impossible for us to quietly handle this matter internally." "That was the intention," Aldrich said. "Yes, I understand that. What I need you to understand is the consequence. By making the protocol public, you have created a political crisis. The Northern Territories are demanding answers. The Ironwood clans are demanding reparations. Our own people are questioning whether they can trust the crown. You have effectively destabilized the kingdom." The kingdom was already unstable. It was just pretending otherwise. "Perhaps, but now the pretense is gone, and we must deal with reality." Evelyn stood. "Here is the council's decision reached after 14 hours of deliberation and more arguments than I care to recount." She picked up a document clearly prepared in advance. "First, The Northern Settlement Protocol is hereby entered into the official historical record, not as a footnote or sealed document, but as a primary source on the Northern expansion. Aldrich's heart beat faster. That was more than he'd expected. Second, a formal inquiry will be established to investigate the burnings. All testimony will be public. All findings will be published. If survivors or descendants can be identified, reparations will be considered pending the inquiry's conclusions. Third, Evelyn's expression hardened. You, Prince Aldrich, are hereby removed from the line of succession. The council will not accept as king someone who has publicly denounced the previous king's policies. Your cousin Lord Brennan will be named heir apparent pending his coronation. The blow landed even though Aldrich had expected it. Not being king was fine. Being formally removed, declared unsuitable, was something else. Fourth and finally, Evelyn looked at Vera and Kao. The council recognizes that you have formed unorthodox familial bonds during your time in the borderlands. While we cannot officially recognize partnerships between humans and orcs under current law, we will not interfere with your private arrangements provided you retire from public life and relinquish all claims to royal privilege. She set down the document. In summary, we will investigate the protocol. We will pursue justice where possible, but you will do so as private citizens, not as members of the royal family. This is the compromise the council could reach. Aldrich absorbed this. It was less than complete victory, more than total defeat, the kind of messy, imperfect outcome that might actually be sustainable. I accept the terms, he said. You understand what you're giving up. I understood what I was giving up when I walked out of the coronation chapel. This just makes it official. Lord Carroll spoke up. There's one additional condition. You must leave Cragmont within 3 days. Your presence here is destabilizing. We need time to manage the political fallout without you as a focal point for opposition. We were planning to leave anyway, Vera said. Cragmont is not our home. Yes, the orc woman. Carrow's tone was dismissive. I'm sure you're eager to return to whatever borderland settlement you emerged from. Millstone Ford, Vera said pleasantly, though I believe the more accurate description would be whatever borderland settlement raised a man brave enough to tell you the truth you spent 17 years hiding from. Carrow's expression curdled. Before he could respond, KL spoke up. Excuse me, his small voice carried in the large chamber. Everyone turned to look at him. I have a question. Evelyn's expression softened slightly. What is it, child? You said father can't be king anymore, but you're going to investigate what the old king did, the bad thing. That's correct. What happens if you find out the bad thing hurt lots of people, more people than you thought? Evelyn glanced at Lady Marissa, who looked uncomfortable. Then we would take appropriate action. What's appropriate action? That would depend on the specific findings. Would you apologize? The question was so simple, so direct, that it seemed to catch the entire council off guard. Yes, there would likely be a formal apology issued. Would you pay people money to help fix what got broken? Reparations would be considered, yes. Kale nodded seriously. That seems right. When I break something, Vera makes me fix it or replace it. Even if it was an accident, especially if it wasn't an accident. He looked at Aldrich. Father says grown-ups should follow the same rules as kids, just with bigger consequences because they have more power. Your father is correct, Evelyn said, and there was something in her voice Aldrich hadn't heard before. We should follow the same rules. We often don't, but we should. She stood. This council's decision stands. Prince Aldrich, simply Aldrich. Now I suppose you have 3 days to settle your affairs and depart Cragmont. After that, you'll be expected to maintain minimal contact with the palace and no involvement in royal politics. Understood. One last thing. Evelyn's voice softened slightly. The house in Millstone Ford, I'm told it's on disputed territory, not technically Ridgeholme jurisdiction. The Crown will issue a formal deed recognizing your ownership such as it is. Consider it a parting gift. Mother, don't just take it and build whatever life you're building there. You've earned at least that much. The chamber began to empty. Council members departing to manage the political chaos about to unfold. Witnesses filing out to spread news of the decision. Master Torvin approached before leaving. He looked at Aldrich with an expression of deep satisfaction. 40 years, he said quietly. 40 years I kept that document wondering if anyone would have the courage to use it. Thank you for proving I didn't keep it for nothing. Thank you for showing me where to find it. I showed you where to look. You did the hard part deciding to act on what you found. He nodded to Vera and Kale. Take care of them, and let them take care of you. That's how this works. After he left, they stood alone in the high chamber, Aldrich, Vera, and Kale. So Vera said eventually, we're officially not royal anymore. Officially, and we have 3 days to leave the capital. Correct. And the kingdom will investigate your father's crimes and possibly provide justice to survivors. Possibly. Then I'd say we won. Did we? Aldrich looked around the chamber. I gave up the throne. I'll never have official influence again. The council can ignore the inquiry findings if they want. What did we actually accomplish? We made it impossible to continue pretending, Vera said. We forced truth into the light. What happens with that truth is now the kingdom's responsibility. Not yours. Kale tugged on Aldrich's sleeve. Father, are we going home now? Yes, back to Millstone Ford. Good. I miss Button's corner. The one here isn't right. Despite everything, Aldrich laughed. Then let's go home. We have 3 days to say goodbye to a palace I never really lived in anyway. They spent those 3 days settling accounts, both literal and metaphorical. Aldrich met with his cousin Brennan, the new heir, and found him surprisingly sympathetic to what Aldrich had done. I always thought the throne would be yours, Brennan said. I wasn't prepared for this responsibility. You'll figure it out, and you'll have an opportunity I didn't to build on a foundation that's been cracked open, to create something better. No pressure, enormous pressure, but that's what makes it worthwhile. He visited Master Torvin in the archives one last time, helping the old man catalog some of the documents that would be essential to the upcoming inquiry. You know, Torvin said while they worked, a king who'd stayed and fought for reform from within might have accomplished more than an exile who threw a stone and ran. Maybe, but I'm not trying to be a reformer king. I'm trying to be a decent father and partner. That's ambitious enough for me. Fair assessment. Evelyn visited their quarters on the last evening, bringing gifts that felt more like apology than celebration. Books for Kyle, a set of quality tools for Vera. For Aldrich, a small portrait of his father as a young man before the crown and the compromises and the Northern Settlement Protocol. Remember him like this, she said quietly, before power taught him that some murders could be called policy. I will. And remember that you're choosing something different. Not just rejecting the crown, actively building an alternative. That matters. They left Cragmont at dawn on the 4th day, traveling north with light packs and lighter hearts. The city was just waking as they rode through the gates. A few early risers recognized Aldrich, the former prince, now just a man traveling with his unusual family. Some stared, some whispered. A few nodded in what might have been respect or might have been simple acknowledgement. One old woman selling bread from a cart near the gate pressed a still warm loaf into Kale's hands as they passed. For the journey, she said, and for telling truth to power, we need more of that. The journey back to Millstone Ford took 10 days. Not because of distance, but because they traveled slowly, stopping to camp to explore, to simply exist without urgency for the first time in weeks. Kale delighted in everything, making camp, learning to fish in mountain streams, listening to Vera tell stories about orc traditions, and Aldrich share histories of kingdoms that rose and fell before Ridgeholm even existed. It's strange, Aldrich said one evening while Kale slept and they sat by the fire. I spent 29 years learning to be king, 3 months learning to be a father and partner. Guess which preparation feels more useful? The recent one. Exactly. Do you regret it? Giving up the throne? Aldrich thought about this seriously. No, I regret that it was necessary. I regret that the kingdom was built on enough lies that telling one truth meant exile. But I don't regret the choice itself. Good, because we're stuck with you now. Stuck is a harsh word. Committed to, permanently attached to, legally bonded, depending our ability to find someone willing to perform an orc-human bonding ceremony. Aldrich looked at her. Is that a proposal? It's a statement of intent. Orcs don't do elaborate proposals. We do clear declarations of what we want and invitations for the other person to agree or object. Then I agree. Good. We'll formalize it when we get home, assuming Millstone Ford is still standing and hasn't been burned down by the kingdom in retaliation. Optimistic of you. I contain multitudes. Millstone Ford was indeed still standing, looking exactly as they'd left it. Their house on the eastern edge, the mill working steadily, the trading post displaying new goods. Mara was at the trading post when they arrived. She took one look at them and said, "Well, you're alive and not in chains. I'd call that a successful trip to the capital." Successful is one word for it, Aldrich said. The other word being catastrophic for your political career, I assume. Comprehensive catastrophe, yes. Good, we could use less politics and more honest people in the borderlands. She pulled out 3 letters from beneath her counter. These came for you while you were in, from the capital, official seals. Aldrich opened them there, while Vera and Kale explored the trading post's new stock. The first was the deed to their property, formal official, recognizing Aldrich's ownership of the house and surrounding land. The second was from the investigative committee, requesting his testimony at upcoming hearings. Formal, polite, but with an undercurrent of, "You started this now, help us finish it." The third was from Queen Mother Evelyn, personal, not official. Brief, "You've set something in motion that can't be stopped. The inquiry has already identified 14 additional survivors willing to testify. Lady Marissa is leading the investigation with more enthusiasm than I expected. Your cousin is terrified but determined. I'm proud of you, though. I wish I'd taught you to accomplish this without destroying your future. But perhaps destroying the future you were given to build one you chose is its own kind of wisdom. Your father would have hated what you did. I think that means you did it correctly." E. Aldrich folded the letter and put it in his pocket. "Good news?" Vera asked, appearing with the KL, who had apparently convinced Mara to sell him a new practice sword. "Complicated news, but yes, ultimately good." They walked home together through the village that had become theirs, not through inheritance or conquest, but through the simple act of choosing to stay. Their house needed work. A month of absence had allowed problems to develop. A shutter had come loose. The garden needed weeding. The roof had developed a small leak. "Well," Vera said, surveying the damage, "welcome home. Let's fix things." They spent the next week settling back into the rhythms of Millstone Ford. Aldrich repaired the shutter, though Vera had to redo it later because he'd hung it slightly crooked. Vera handled the roof. Kale triumphantly pulled every weed from the garden and received praise entirely out of proportion to the actual accomplishment. News from the capital trickled in through travelers and official letters. The inquiry was proceeding. Testimony was being heard. The kingdom was slowly and painfully beginning to reckon with what had been done in its name. It would take years, perhaps decades, possibly longer than Aldrich would live to see completed. But it had begun. That was enough. 6 months after their return, on a cool evening, with the first hint of approaching winter in the air, Millstone Ford gathered for a ceremony that had never been performed in the borderlands before. An orc-human bonding conducted by an orc elder from the Ironwood clans and a priest from the Cathedral of Records who traveled north specifically for the occasion. Aldrich and Vera stood before their community humans and orcs who'd chosen to build lives in this uncertain space between territories and spoke vows that acknowledged both traditions while creating something new. Kel stood between them, holding their Morrowind hands, serving as bond witness in the orc tradition and ring bearer in the human tradition, taking both roles with intense seriousness. "We are bound," Vera said in Orcish, then repeated in the common tongue, "not by law or decree, but by choice, daily choice. The choice to stay when leaving would be easier, the choice to build when destruction is simpler, the choice to love across divisions that others call insurmountable." "We are bound," Aldrich echoed, "not by inheritance or duty, but by commitment. To each other, to the child we raised together, to the truth we've chosen over comfort. This bond is our declaration that the old divisions no longer define us." The elder and the priest spoke blessings in their respective traditions. The community, still small, still uncertain, but genuinely trying, witnessed and celebrated. That night, after the celebration ended and Kale was asleep and the house was quiet, Aldrich and Vera sat on their porch and looked at the stars. "Do you think it will last?" Aldrich asked. "The inquiry, the reforms, the slow change we set in motion. Some of it will, some won't. Change is never complete in one generation. We plant seeds, others tend the garden." Profound. I have moments of profundity. They come between bouts of fixing things you've broken. I don't break that many things. You broke an entire kingdom's comfortable lies. I'd say that counts. Aldrich laughed. Fair point. They sat in comfortable silence. Two people who'd chosen each other against every reasonable objection, who'd built a life from impossible materials, who'd proven that the divisions others insisted were permanent, were actually just choices that could be unmade. Inside, a 6-year-old boy slept peacefully, untroubled by the complexity of his heritage or the political chaos his very existence represented to some. He was simply loved, simply safe, simply growing up in a house where truth mattered more than comfort and family was defined by choice rather than bloodline. That was the real victory, not the inquiry or the reforms or the formal acknowledgement of historical crimes. But this a child sleeping peacefully, while adults who loved him sat on the porch and watched stars knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to choose truth over comfort, love over division, building over burning. The kingdom Aldrich had renounced would continue its slow, painful reckoning with the past. His cousin would try to build something better on the cracked foundation. The inquiry would uncover more truths, possibly more crimes, certainly more complexity. All of that mattered. All of that was important. But here in this small house on the edge of everywhere and nowhere, Aldrich had found something more valuable than any crown, a life worth living, a love worth fighting for, a family worth building one imperfect day at a time. 2 years after the bonding ceremony, Millstone Ford had transformed in ways no one could have predicted when Aldrich first arrived. The village population had grown from 47 to nearly 200. Not explosive growth, but steady, deliberate people arriving because they had heard about the place where the former crown prince lived with an orc family, where humans and orcs traded without suspicion, where the old divisions were treated as choices rather than inevitabilities. Some came out of curiosity, some came fleeing their own impossible situations. Some came because they'd read about the Northern Settlement Protocol inquiry in broadsheets and wanted to see what a community built on truth rather than comfortable lies actually looked like. Aldrich had not anticipated becoming a symbol. He'd wanted to be a private citizen, raising Kyle, building a life with Vera, perhaps doing some carpentry that didn't result in Vera having to fix his mistakes. The universe, it seemed, had other plans. The first sign that privacy would be difficult came 6 months after their return, when a group of young scholars arrived from Cragmont University asking to interview him about his decision to abandon the throne. "We're writing a treatise on moral leadership," their spokesperson had explained to earnest young woman named Elise with ink-stained fingers and intense eyes. "Your choice to prioritize truth over power is unprecedented in recent history. We'd like to understand your reasoning." "My reasoning was that I couldn't be king of a kingdom built on murdered civilians," Aldrich had said. "That's not very complicated." "But it is," Elise had insisted. "Most people in your position would have rationalized it, found a way to compartmentalize the past from the present. You didn't. Why, mine?" Aldrich had looked at Vera, who'd been listening from where she was repairing a fence post. She'd raised an eyebrow in the expression that meant "your mess, you explain it." "Because I was in love with someone whose cousin died from injuries sustained in those burnings," Aldrich had finally said. "Because I was raising a boy orphaned by the long-term effects of my father's policy. Because truth stopped when being abstract and became personal, and once it's personal, you can't unknow it." The scholars had written that down with the fevered intensity of people who'd found exactly what they were looking for. After they left, Vera had said, "You know they're going to buy an ad to publish that. You know more people will come." "I know. And you're all right with that." "No, but I don't know how to stop it without becoming the kind of person who hides from uncomfortable truths, and we've established that's not working for me anymore." More visitors had come, journalists writing about the inquiry, religious scholars debating the ethics of his choice, political theorists examining whether kingdoms could reform from within or needed external pressure like what Aldrich had provided. Most recently, a steady trickle of mixed families, orc and human partnerships that faced hostility in their home communities, seeking advice, support, or simply proof that it was possible to build a life together. Aldrich and Vera had started hosting monthly gatherings for these families. Nothing formal, just shared meals and conversation, children playing together, while adults traded strategies for navigating a world that hadn't caught up to their existence yet. Kyle, now 8 years old and showing signs of the height he'd inherit from Vera's side, had appointed himself unofficial greeter for these gatherings. He'd stand at the door with Button, the practice dummy, now showing serious wear from 2 years of enthusiastic combat, and announce each family's arrival with elaborate formality. Presenting the Ironwood Marshals, they have traveled from the Eastern Territories. They brought pie. It delighted everyone and gave the gatherings a ceremony that made the awkwardness of first meetings easier to navigate. But the growth brought challenges. The most significant came 15 months after their return, when the Royal Inquiry into the Northern Settlement Protocol released its preliminary findings. Aldrich was in the garden when the courier arrived, official Crown messenger, exhausted horse-sealed document bearing the investigative committee's mark. The findings were comprehensive and damning. The inquiry had identified not just the original 60 deaths, but evidence of systematic displacement affecting hundreds more. They'd found documentation of falsified reports, destroyed evidence, payments made to witnesses to change their testimony. And they'd found something else, evidence that the Northern Settlement Protocol hadn't been a unique incident, but part of a broader pattern. 5 other defensive actions over the previous 20 years, all following the same structure, create a crisis, blame it on orcs, justify expansion, profit from the land acquisition. The report recommended full reparations, criminal prosecution of surviving officials who'd participated in the cover-up, in fundamental reform of how Ridgeholme handled border policy. Attached to the official report was a personal letter from Lady Marissa, who'd led the investigation, Prince Aldrich, I should say. The full findings are worse than even you suspected. Your father's protocol wasn't an aberration. It was standard operating procedure. We've identified 187 total deaths across 6 incidents, not counting long-term casualties like Kale's mother. The council is in chaos. Some want to suppress the report, others want full publication and reform. Your cousin Brennan is supporting publication, but he's facing enormous pressure. I thought you should know what your choice to expose this has uncovered. For what it's worth, I believe you were right. The kingdom needs this reckoning, even if it's painful, especially because it's painful. Imvara found him still in the garden an hour later, sitting among the tomato plants with the report spread across his lap. Bad news, she asked, sitting beside him. Complicated news. He handed her the report. The inquiry found more than I expected. Much more. She read in silence, her expression darkening as she processed the scope of what the investigation had uncovered. 187 people, she said finally, across 6 incidents. That's not policy. That's systematic murder. Yes. And the council is debating whether to publish this. Yes. After you've already made the first protocol public. After survivors have testified. After the entire kingdom has been following the inquiry. She looked at him. They'd have to be remarkably stupid to think they can suppress this now. Never underestimate the capacity of powerful people to choose comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths. Cynical of you. Learn from experience. Vera folded the report and handed it back. What are you going to do? I don't know. I'm not in the capital anymore. I don't have official standing. I can't influence the council's decision. You influenced it before by making truth public before they could control the narrative. You think I should do that again? I think you should consider whether this is your fight or theirs. You exposed the original crime. The inquiry has done its work. Whether the kingdom chooses to face the full truth is now the kingdom's choice. But if they suppress this, then they'll face consequences. There are too many people who know now, too many witnesses, too many scholars and journalists and ordinary citizens who've been following the inquiry. Suppression might work for a week, maybe a month, but truth has momentum. You gave it that momentum. Let it roll forward on its own. Aldrich looked at the report again, at the neat documentation of 187 deaths, at the careful language that tried to make systematic murder sound like policy disagreements. You're right, he said. This isn't my fight anymore. I lit the fire. Whether the kingdom uses it to cook or to burn itself down is their choice. Good. Now come help me with the fence. Kale tried to improve it yesterday, and we now have what can generously be described as a creative approach to structural integrity. Despite everything, Aldrich laughed. How creative? He's attached Button to one of the posts as a fence guardian. I don't have the heart to tell him that practice dummies don't actually scare away deer. The kingdom's choice came 3 weeks later. Full publication of the inquiry findings. Not in sealed official records, but in public broadsheets distributed to every major city and town. Complete transparency about the 6 incidents, 187 deaths, the systematic nature of the deception. Alongside the findings, King Brennan, recently crowned, still finding his footing, issued a formal apology. Not the careful political language of regrettable circumstances, but a direct acknowledgement these were murders, committed by agents of the Crown, authorized by Crown policy, covered up by Crown officials. We cannot undo these deaths. We cannot restore what was taken, but we can acknowledge what was done and commit to ensuring it never happens again. The victims and their families deserve truth, justice, and reparations. They will receive all three. The reparations program was established within a month. Not just financial compensation, but land grants, educational opportunities for descendants, formal memorialization of the destroyed settlements. It wasn't perfect. Nothing could be perfect when addressing historical injustice, but it was real, substantive, and represented a fundamental shift in how Ridgeholme approached its relationship with Orc communities. Aldrich read about all of this in broadsheets that arrived weeks late in Millstone Ford, feeling strange to be following from a distance events he had set in motion. Does it feel odd, Vera asked one evening as they read the latest news, watching this happen without you? Yes and no. Odd to not be in the center of it, but also relieving. This is their work now, the kingdom's reckoning with itself. I played my part. Your part being destroying your political future and exiling yourself to the borderlands. Exactly, classic royal martyrdom. He set down the broadsheet. Though I notice the martyrdom comes with an excellent partner and a son who's currently trying to teach Button advanced sword techniques. They could hear Cal in the yard narrating an elaborate battle between Button and imaginary forces. His voice had started to deepen slightly, the first hints of the changes that would come over the next few years. He's growing up, Vera said, following his thoughts. Too fast. That's what parents always say. Are we parents officially? Vera considered this. Officially is a strange word for what we are. By Orc custom, yes, you've been his Derek for years, the one who teaches and stays. By human custom, it's more complicated since you're not his blood father. But Kyle calls you father. You act as his father. We raise him together. I'd say that's official enough. Good, because I was thinking about something. Dangerous words. The families who come here, the mixed partnerships seeking community, they often struggle with the legal questions around children who has custody, what rights each parent has, how to navigate systems built for single-species families. Yes. What if we helped formalize that, created some kind of legal framework for mixed families? Not through Ridgeholme law, which would take decades of reform, but through borderland custom. Something that communities like Millstone Ford could recognize, even if the kingdoms don't yet. Vara was quiet for a moment, thinking. A parallel legal structure. Exactly. For people living in the uncertain spaces where kingdom law doesn't quite reach, where Orc clan law doesn't quite apply. We create something that serves the reality of how people are actually living. That's ambitious. I learned it from watching someone lift an entire wagon to prove a point about fixing the actual problem. I'm never going to live down that wagon, am I? Never. Fine, then let's do it. But you're writing the first draft because your handwriting is legible and mine is what Kyle kindly described as very strong and personality-filled. Aldrich laughed. I'll write the first draft. The Millstone Accords, as they came to be called, took 8 months to develop. Not just Aldrich and Vera, but input from the mixed families who'd settled in the area, from Orc elders who understood traditional clan law, from human legal scholars, willing to think creatively about problems their training hadn't prepared them for. The result was a document that acknowledged the reality of mixed families while respecting both Orc and human legal traditions. It established frameworks for custody, inheritance, partnership recognition, and child welfare that served families existing between two cultures. It wasn't legally binding in any kingdom or clan territory, but it was recognized in Millstone Ford, and gradually in other borderland communities where mixed families were building lives. 3 years after Aldrich had abandoned his coronation, there were 12 communities across the borderlands using the Millstone Accords as the basis for their own legal frameworks. Small numbers, but growing. You've become a different kind of leader, Vera observed one evening as they reviewed a letter from a community in the Western Territories requesting copies of the Accords. I haven't become any kind of leader. I'm just someone who wrote down common sense approaches to new problems. Leaders often are just people who write down common sense. The difference is you're doing it without seeking power over anyone. I'm allergic to power now. It makes me break out in ethical crises. Very dramatic. I contain multitudes. Kale, now 10 years old and tall enough that Aldrich had to look up slightly to meet his eyes, wandered into the conversation, carrying a book. Father Vera, I have a question about this. He set the book on the table. It was one of the historical texts Aldrich had brought from the Palace Library, a chronicle of Ridgeholm's early years. What's your question? Aldrich asked. It says here that the first king united the territories through strength and wisdom. But then later it talks about how he defeated the Orkwai raiders who threatened the settlements. Was that before people understood that orcs were just people, or did they understand and not care? Aldrich and Vera exchanged a look. These questions came up periodically as Kael grew older and more capable of understanding the complex history his own existence bridged. Probably both, Aldrich said carefully. Some people genuinely didn't understand. Others understood but found it convenient to pretend they didn't because it justified taking land or resources. And some people just inherited those attitudes without questioning them. Like your father. Yes, like my father. But you questioned them. Eventually, not as soon as I should have, not until it became personal. Kale absorbed this. Is that bad? That it had to be personal before you cared? It's honest. I wish I'd been the kind of person who cared about injustice in the abstract. But I wasn't. I needed to see the real cost, to see you, to know Vera, to understand that the policies were hurting actual people I loved. That's not heroic, it's just human. But you did care eventually. That's what matters, right? You can't change when you started caring, only what you do after you start. Vera smiled. When did you become wise? I've always been wise. You just didn't notice because I was short. Kale grinned, Ed. But seriously, I've been thinking about this because some of the kids in the village, the human kids, they say their parents say I shouldn't exist. That mixing orc and human is wrong. Aldrich felt something cold settle in his chest. Who said that? It doesn't matter who. What matters is whether they're right. They're not right. But how do I know? Just because you say they're wrong doesn't make it true. You're biased, you love Vera, you've chosen to raise me. How do I know you're right and they're wrong? It was a fair question, a devastating question from a 10-year-old trying to understand where he fit in a world that kept insisting he didn't. Vera spoke before Aldrich could. You know because you exist, she said. Not as a theory or a political statement, but as a person. You are not wrong. You are not a mistake. You are a child who was loved by his birth parents, who is loved now by his family, who is growing into a good person. The people who say you shouldn't exist are denying reality. You are real. You are here. Their categories are failing to describe the world as it actually is, which means their categories are wrong, not you. Kyle was quiet for a moment. That's a good answer. Thank you. I've been preparing it for when this question inevitably came up. How long have you been preparing? Since the day we took you in. I knew eventually the world would try to convince you that you were the problem instead of their narrow thinking. I wanted to have the right words ready. You did good. I did well. Grammar matters. Vera, you just gave me a beautiful speech about my inherent worth as a person. Don't ruin it by correcting my grammar. I can do both. I contain multitudes. Aldrich laughed so hard he had to put his head down on the table. The challenges didn't stop. Living at the edge of changing social norms meant constantly navigating situations no one had established protocols for. When Kyle turned 11, questions arose about his education. The local school teacher, a kind woman named Iris, who'd moved to Millstone Ford specifically because she believed in the community's mission, was capable of teaching basic subjects. But as Kyle grew older and his interests developed, he needed more advanced instruction. Sending him to a city school meant confronting all the prejudices he'd been somewhat sheltered from in Millstone Ford. Keeping him in the borderlands meant limiting his opportunities. I want to learn, Kale said when they discussed it. I want to understand history and mathematics, and how governments work. I want to read the books in your palace library that you talk about, but I don't want to pretend to be something I'm not to make city people comfortable. You shouldn't have to, Aldrich said, but I will have to. If I go to Cragmont University or any other major school, they'll want me to minimize the orc parts of myself, to be as human passing as possible. I've heard stories from other mixed kids. Then we find a different solution, Vera said. We bring the education here. Hire tutors willing to travel to the borderlands. Create a school for mixed children and any others who want an education that doesn't require assimilation. That's expensive. Then we raise funds from the families who benefit, from sympathetic scholars, from my former position's remaining influence. Aldrich smiled. Turns out being a disgraced former prince is still worth something to people who value what I did over what I gave up. The school took 2 years to establish. Not a grand institution, but a solid one. 3 full-time teachers, visiting scholars rotating through for specialized subjects, a library assembled from donations and purchases. It served initially 12 students, within a year 23. Within 3 years, 41 drawing families from across the borderlands who wanted their children educated without having to choose between their heritage and their learning. Kale thrived there. His interests ran toward history and ethics, unsurprising given his family's circumstances, and he showed a particular talent for seeing patterns across different cultures' approaches to similar problems. He's going to write the history of this period someday, one of his teachers predicted, the transformation in orc-human relations. And he'll write it from inside the change, which will make it invaluable. I'm not writing anything, Kale insisted when Aldrich mentioned this. I'm just trying to understand why people make the choices they make. That's what historians do. Then I guess I'm going to be a historian who thinks historians are too focused on great men and not enough on ordinary people making difficult choices. Revolutionary. I learned from watching a prince abandon his throne for ordinary happiness. Seems to me the ordinary choices are where the real story is. 5 years after abandoning his coronation, Aldrich received a letter that changed the trajectory of everything they'd built. It came from King Brennan, written in his own hand, rather than dictated to a scribe. Aldrich. The kingdom has changed more in 5 years than in the previous 50. The reparations program continues. Mixed partnerships are no longer illegal in the capital, though they're still controversial. The borderlands are more stable than they've been in living memory. And yesterday, the council voted to formally recognize the Millstone Accords as valid legal framework for borderland communities. Not as kingdom law, but as legitimate parallel system where kingdom law doesn't adequately serve reality. This is because of you, because you chose truth over comfort, because you built something real instead of complaining that the system was broken. I'm writing to ask, would you consider serving as official liaison between the kingdom and borderland communities? Not as a royal role you have made clear you want no part of that, but as someone who understands both worlds and has the trust of both. Someone who can help navigate the inevitable conflicts that arise when different legal systems interact. I know you've built a life in Millstone Ford. I'm not asking you to abandon it, but I am asking if you'd be willing to expand it, to be a bridge between the kingdom and the communities that exist in its margins. Think about it. No pressure. Well, some pressure. The kingdom is in desperate need of people who actually understand how to make integration work, rather than just theorize about it. But minimal pressure. Probably. B. Aldrich showed the letter to Vera that evening. She read it twice, then set it down carefully. What do you want to do? She asked. I don't know. Part of me wants to refuse immediately. We've built something good here. I don't want to complicate it with official roles. And the other part remembers why I exposed the protocol in the first place. Because truth matters. Because building better systems matters. This would be a chance to do that work directly instead of just from the margins. You'd be traveling, a lot, back and forth to the capital, meeting with officials, navigating politics you specifically left to avoid. Yes. And you'd be representing communities, including ours, which means your choices would affect all of us. Yes. But you'd also be in position to actually solve problems, to prevent the kind of systematic injustice that created the Northern Settlement Protocol, to build frameworks that serve real people instead of abstract theories. Yes, Vera was quiet for a long moment. I think you should do it. Really, You walked away from the throne because you couldn't be king of a kingdom built on lies. This isn't being king, it's being a translator between worlds. You're good at that, and it's work that needs doing. What about you, about KL? I'd be gone weeks at a time. I've been raising children through difficult circumstances for years. I'll manage. And Kyle is old enough now that he doesn't need constant supervision. He needs guidance which you can provide, even if you're not physically present every day. Are you sure? No, but I'm willing to try. Same as everything else we've built, one uncertain step at a time, fixing problems as they arise, trusting that good intentions plus consistent effort eventually creates something worthwhile. Aldrich accepted the position. The work was exactly as difficult as he'd feared, and more important than he'd hoped. He spent 2 weeks of every month traveling between borderland communities and the capital, carrying concerns from margins to center and bringing resources from center to margins. He mediated disputes over land rights, helped establish trade agreements that benefited both kingdom and clans, advised on education policy for mixed communities, testified before the council on issues affecting borderland populations. It was exhausting. It was necessary. It was making real difference. And every other week he came home to Millstone Ford, to Vera and Kyle, and the life they'd built together, and remembered why the work mattered. 7 years after abandoning his coronation on the evening of Kyle's 14th birthday, Aldrich sat on the porch with Vera watching sunset paint the mountains in shades of copper and gold. "We did something impossible," he said. "We did several impossible things. Be specific. We built a family from pieces that weren't supposed to fit together. We created legal frameworks from scratch. We proved that the old divisions were choices, not destinies. We raised a boy who exists as living proof that different worlds can merge into something new. Yes, we did all that. And I still can't build a fence that doesn't require your corrections. Some things are permanent limitations. We accept them and move on." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the light fade and the first stars emerge. Inside, they could hear Kale talking with friends who'd come for his birthday gathering, a mix of human and orc teenagers who'd grown up in the borderlands and didn't question that their friend group crossed lines that previous generations had considered absolute. "Do you ever regret it?" Vera asked. "The throne you gave up, the power you could have had?" "Never, not once," Aldrich took her hand. "I gave up a crown to gain a life. That's not sacrifice. That's the best trade I ever made." "Good answer. I've been preparing it." "How long?" "Since the day I jumped out of that chapel window and rode north towards something I couldn't name but knew I needed." He squeezed her hand. "Turned out what I needed was you. And Kyle. And this impossible life we built from honest materials." Very poetic. "I'm allowed occasional poetry. I'm a reformed prince. We're known for our dramatic declarations." Vera laughed, the sound warm and familiar and home. Above them, stars filled the sky, the same stars that shone over Cragmont and the Ironwood territories and every other place where people struggled to build lives in the face of systems that didn't quite fit their reality. But here in this small house at the edge of everywhere and nowhere, Aldrich had found something no crown could have given him, the freedom to be simply himself. Simply a father, a partner, a bridge builder, a man who'd chosen truth over comfort and found that truth, while costly, was infinitely more valuable than any power he'd abandoned. That was the real story, not the dramatic gesture of walking away from coronation, but the daily choice to stay, to keep building, keep loving, keep working toward a world where the divisions that seemed permanent were revealed as merely historical choices that could be unmade. 7 years, hundreds of small decisions, thousands of ordinary moments. One impossible family proving every day that impossible was just another word for not yet.